Good afternoon. I'm Leslie. Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the U.S. and Americas program here at Chatham House. It's wonderful to see all of you on this call. We are very glad to be able to host this incredibly important conversation on a topic that I think is front and center of all of our minds, the elements of the China challenge. Certainly, it's difficult to imagine a better positioned person to have, in addition to being a very well-known scholar who's written extensively on many issues, political philosopher. It's difficult to imagine a better positioned person to lead this conversation. We have Dr. Peter Berkowitz, who is currently the director of the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, working, of course, to Secretary Pompeo. He is also the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where he was before he joined the Department of State in his current role. Peter is a very well-known political philosopher and scholar in the U.S. Academy. He taught at Harvard throughout the 1990s. I first came across you, Peter, when Georgetown University brought you in to liaise and be a scholar in the department and the Center of Jewish Civilization. So it is tremendous that you've been willing to speak with us. Today's session is on the record. We are recording. I should say I was having a look at your writings, Peter, on your website. I recommend these to all of you very highly, peterberkowitz.com, I believe it is.
Yes.
And you made a very interesting remark, which is that in the recent months, the National Security Advisor, the FBI Director, the Attorney General, and the U.S. Secretary of State have all given speeches on the need to address the Communist Party of China's resolute efforts to marshal its dictatorial powers to undercut America's interests and transform world order. And then you went on to say that the restrained reaction to this suggests that there is an emerging consensus about the urgency of the China challenge. I assume you meant in the United States, although I don't think you said that. And interestingly, for those of you who are following Peter's work, Peter has been heavily involved as part of the writing of the recently published Commission on Unalienable Rights, Secretary Pompeo's, the commission that he set up. And you also noted that people have been much more up in arms about the Commission's report than they have about these recent speeches on China. So clearly we chose the right topic. We've chosen the right person. Thank you for joining us. I know you're here in London, and I hope that you will return and speak in person at Chatham House when that becomes possible. But we're very grateful to you. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to you to speak with us for however long you wish, perhaps 15 minutes.
Yes.
And then we will immediately turn to everybody for questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Leslie. It's really great to be with you and with the group you've assembled for what I agree. It's an important conversation about the China challenge. Let me begin this way, saying that when I became director of policy planning staff about 14 months ago, Secretary Pompeo made clear to me, as he had made clear throughout the State Department, that he wished for all of us to approach foreign policy through the lens of the China challenge, not because he wanted to neglect other regions of the world, but because the China challenge was a challenge that was unfolding throughout all regions of the world. And as for its urgency, he likes to say that his first thought upon rising in the morning and last thought before going to sleep at night is the China challenge. That reflects the importance that he attaches to it. So we took the Secretary's priority very seriously. And so the policy planning staff, part of the Office of the Secretary, which, as you know, has responsibility for covering long-term way all regions of the world, all functional areas of world affairs, has been focusing on the China challenge. And some of the opinions I'm going to offer now grow out of the team's work. Why don't I begin with reading to you a statement. The statement goes as follows. For a fairly long time yet, excuse me, Socialism in its primary stage will exist alongside a more productive and developed capitalist system. In this long period of cooperation and conflict, socialism must learn from the boons that capitalism has brought to civilization. We must face the reality that people will use the strengths of developed Western countries to denounce our country's socialist development. Here we must have a great strategic determination, resolutely rejecting all false arguments that we should abandon socialism. We must consciously correct the various ideas that do not accord with our current stage. Most importantly, we must concentrate our efforts on bettering our own affairs, continually broadening our comprehensive national power, improving the lives of our people, building a socialism that is superior to capitalism, and laying the foundation for a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position. Those are the lines of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, in a speech titled "Uphold and Develop Socialism with Chinese Characteristics," delivered to the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, January 5th, 2013. Now here's the all-important question. What does Xi Jinping mean when he looks forward to a future in which we will win the initiative, have the dominant position? What does that mean? Win the initiative and have the dominant position. That's the question and policy planning staff we've wanted to understand. We understand China's ambitions in terms of two goals: preeminence within the established order, and way more importantly, an effort to reconfigure the established order, that is, reconfigure the free and open order that the United States took the lead in creating after World War II, to make an international order that is more friendly to, that serves better the interests of the socialism with Chinese characteristics that Chinese leaders since Deng have referred to. Now, I should say also that it's taken the United States a long time to come to an appreciation of the China challenge. Like many other countries around the world, for decades, we looked at the modernization that Deng set in motion in the late 1970s. We looked at the incorporation of capitalist elements into China's socialism as bringing great benefits, not only to the people of China, but to countries around the world because of new opportunities of trade with the world's most populous nation, today almost 1.4 billion people. But the Chinese Communist Party, which does rule China in a dictatorial fashion, has never understood modernization and opening up of the economy in the way we in the United States had. They always understood it, and this is evident from CCP speeches since the late 1970s. They had always understood this modernization and the partial inclusion of capitalist elements as serving a greater goal. Greater goal is preeminence for China first, and eventually transfiguration of world order. Why did the United States miss this for so long? Well, there are many reasons. They're connected to the American propensity to understand other nations as like the United States, as doing what the United States would do, were the United States similarly situated. They have something to do with Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, the idea that the world was developing slowly but surely toward a small L liberal and small D democratic future. It had something to do with a general American optimism and a commitment to peace through trade and commerce. But those hopes have been disappointed. We should have seen that they were disappointed long ago. It's not so much that Xi Jinping has different aspirations than his predecessors, previous Chinese leaders. It's that as a result of the economic development and the modernization that Deng unleashed, China is now in a position to act more aggressively on what has always been the Chinese dream. So what are the the practical elements of China's conduct. We identify several. First of all, there's authoritarianism at home. The Communist Party of China rules in a manner that's quite consistent with the Marxism-Leninism of the 20th century. The party is supreme. The party is the only party. There are 7 or 8 quasi-independent parties. They all answer to the CCP. The party subordinates the individual to the party's interests. Xi's Chinese Communist Party has engaged in, I should say, intensified indoctrination. He runs the most comprehensive police surveillance state the world has ever seen, thanks in part to great advances in digital technology. As you all know, and I've been pleased to learn from my conversations early in the day, that the UK is acutely aware of the hideous human rights abuses in China, starting with some 1 million Uyghurs imprisoned in re-education camps, concentration camps in Western China, but also including the repression of Tibetans and increasing repression of ethnic Mongolians in the northeastern part of China. And that's to add to the general attack on religious freedom throughout China. I should not leave out the oppression of China's approximately 70 million Christians. Of course, people here in the UK are acutely aware of China's betrayal of its solemn international promises in imposing a national security law on Hong Kong, the threats it makes to Taiwan, its claims of sovereign control way out into the South China Sea, far beyond anything that international law recognized. So that's one element of the China challenge. Another element of the China challenge is the leverage that it uses through its tremendous economic power to induce dependency on nation states around the world. And we've identified a number of stratagems or techniques that China employs. It varies from region to region, but in every region of the world, you'll find some combination of these stratagems. They include, among others, commandeering of supply chains. They involve massive intellectual property theft, probably the greatest in terms of sheer money, the most costly acts of theft in human history. They're theft year in, year out of intellectual property. There is also China's quest for industrial dominance in a variety of industries, but especially in the high-tech industries of the future. There is China's quest to become the 5G provider of choice around the world, which would guarantee a steady supply of massive amounts of data to China, which would give that from around the world, which would give China a tremendous advantage in developing the artificial intelligence algorithms of the future. You know about the Belt and Road Initiative. There's now building of infrastructure all around the world. This is part of China's debt trap diplomacy, in which what appear to be good deals for the building of ports, roads, railways, nuclear reactors for civilian use, and more, turn out to be deals that empower China, put nation states in compromised positions, and really threaten their sovereignty. And then, of course, there are the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party uses the freedom and openness of liberal democracies to our disadvantage. I know that the UK, as does the United States, faces a challenge with Confucius Institutes. You face a challenge with students from China who come to the UK, as we do in the United States, a number of whom really operate as spies, or some of whom don't come as spies, but are put under severe pressure by the government in China to either to transfer information or at least toe the party line while they are in host countries. All this we think is a is a great danger. And again, if we had more time, we could go over the specific inroads that China has made, starting in the Indo-Pacific, but stretching to every region of the world. We also see an effort by China, quite consistent with Xi's speeches, to conscript international organizations, to instill in these international organizations alternative standards, alternative norms, which are more friendly to the authoritarianism and the socialism at the core of the vision of the Chinese Communist Party. I should also mention, it's sometimes neglected, that the Chinese Communist Party often speaks about the imperative of developing a, quote, world-class military, and they are well on their way to achieving that goal if they haven't already built a world-class military. Not only is this do they aim at a world-class military in conventional areas, but also they are making rapid strides in the field of space and the field of cyber and artificial intelligence as applied to military affairs. So when you take all of this together, it looks as if China is making a credible effort to not only gain preeminence through its economic might, but actually transform international institutions so as to place Beijing at the center, and so that those international institutions reflect the norms and standards that are consistent with the outlook of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, returning to the point about recognizing the dimensions of the China challenge, I've already spoken to some reasons why the United States has been slow to appreciate, but there's another consideration. That is, we simply haven't paid enough attention to what the Chinese Communist Party says about its governing ideas and its guiding aims. You can purchase in English the 3-volume collected works of Xi Jinping. You can get them from Amazon. It's well worth doing. I encourage you all to do so. What does one discover when one reads and reads seriously Xi's speeches and the speeches of his predecessors? One discovers that the outlook of the Chinese Communist Party is authoritarian, collectivist, and imperialist, and that two real streams of thought nourish the Chinese Communist Party's outlook. And by the way, I keep referring to the Chinese Communist Party because it's important to distinguish, as Secretary Pompeo is always careful to do, between the Chinese Communist Party, which rules China in dictatorial fashion, and the people of China, who in many cases have different views. But right now it's the Chinese Communist Party that makes policy, that's governed, and so it's incumbent upon us to understand what drives them, the ideas that help explain their conduct. So as I said, the sensibility is authoritarian, collectivist, imperial. It's nourished by 2 strains. One is a sort of dogmatic Marxism-Leninism. They're absolutely clear about this. Every chance they have, they affirm that whatever the changes, whatever the shifts, whatever the vicissitudes in Chinese politics, whatever elements of capitalism it was necessary to import into China to jumpstart economic development, China remains committed to socialism, to the doctrines of Marxism-Leninism. But it's also important to see that the Chinese Communist Party is driven by an extreme interpretation of Chinese nationalism. Excuse me. Why do I say that? Because it's really, it's evident from their writings, it's evident from their conduct, and it's because certain features of China's conduct cannot be explained in terms of mere Marxism-Leninism. For example, under Xi, the Chinese Communist Party has been very keen on indoctrinating the Chinese people with a racist vision of Chinese cultural and institutional superiority. One will not find that idea in the basic ideas of Marxism-Leninism. China has insisted, the CCP insists, that it cannot be whole unless it is reunited with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, and exercises its rightful sovereignty over wide areas of the South China Sea. You will not find any imperative, any instruction that Taiwan must be part of the People's Republic of China in the Marxist-Leninist playbook. And you will not find in the Marxist-Leninist playbook explanation for the Chinese strategy of inducing economic dependence through economic clout. For all of that, one has to look to the CCP's understanding of the Chinese nation. So I think it was in 2017, she had inscribed in the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party the concept of the Chinese dream based on national rejuvenation. The Chinese dream based on national rejuvenation. What is that? Well, as I've already mentioned, reunification with Hong Kong and Taiwan. But national rejuvenation also means a transformation of world order in socialist terms. So for the Chinese Communist Party, socialism and nationalism are not, as they might be in other circumstances, given different interpretations of socialism and given other forms of nationalism, are not in conflict with one another, but in the CCP's interpretation, they work hand in hand with one another to guide China's quest for dominance in all regions of the world, and ultimately for the transformation of international institutions. I'll conclude with just one or two remarks. We don't for a moment mean to imply that China is some kind of invulnerable giant. China suffers from many vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities from which it suffers begin from vulnerabilities associated with all autocracies, all authoritarian governments. All authoritarian governments, one, have problems maintaining over the long-term innovation. I'm aware that over the short term, China's done pretty well over the last 2 or 3 decades. Of course, their innovation has been not only jump-started, but sustained by massive intellectual property theft. A second problem that authoritarian governments tend to have down through history has been their ability to maintain alliances. It turns out that authoritarian governments don't make good allies. Usually they can only forge alliances with other authoritarian governments, and neither side tends to trust the other. And third, authoritarian governments historically have to spend a great deal of money on suppressing dissent internally. This is the case with China as well. In addition to those standard problems of authoritarian governments, we have to keep in mind that in various ways, China is showing economic vulnerability. Some forms have been exacerbated by the global pandemic. They have, as I know you all are aware, they've suffered significant environmental degradation. They have demographic problems. They have corruption problems. They have a host of problems which we should be aware of. I should make clear one other point that in this talk in general, for the purposes of this talk, I've come to outline the challenge, and I'm glad to speak about the general perspective from which the United States has been proceeding, and I hope we'll continue to address the China challenge. I'd be happy to articulate a kind of broad framework in the policy planning staff that we've been working on that we think should inform China challenge. I'm unlikely to enter into the nuts and bolts of any particular policy, but we can see. Leslie, why don't I stop there and see whether I've managed to provoke any questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to confirm for everybody that we are on the record. That means you're on the record when you ask questions. I'm going to ask you a question, Peter, but then I'm going to go ahead and take the next question before you give a reply, so that we immediately bring another voice into this conversation. So please, if you use the raised hand function, or if you put your question in the chat, I will call on you to speak your question. I guess, Peter, obviously a number of things that you've put on the table, your interpretation and evaluation of China is, we all know this is subject to a lot of dispute, right? We've read, even if some of the broad contours might be accepted by many who are engaged in a very deep dispute about what China's intentions are. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm sure that many people are going to pick that up. And I guess the question that I would like to pose to you is sort of twofold. First of all, why do you think that Europe, and obviously Europe, differs a lot from itself, but why do you think that so much of Europe reads China differently from how you have just read China? Firstly, and secondly, if in your last couple of points, innovation is hard to maintain, and it's hard for autocracies to maintain alliances. If those two things are true, and if the logical implication of those things is that really in the medium to long term, China's unlikely, and I'm reading out from what you've intimated, unlikely to present a grave challenge, why not kind of, let it run its course? But before you answer either one of those questions, let's open it up, and I'm going to come immediately to David Manning, who's bound to ask a good question. But David, if you could also introduce yourself, not that you need an introduction, but you never know. There's a lot of generations on the call, so if you'd say who you are.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you to Peter for the remarks. I'm a former British diplomat and was ambassador in Washington rather a long time ago now, but now I'm lucky enough to have a berth in Chatham House. Peter, could I ask you to expand a little bit on what you were saying at the end there about the vulnerabilities of China, which I think are very interesting, and in particular how you and the planning staff assess the party, how monolithic it is, how far an apparently totally dominant Xi Jinping is really dominant, and what challenges you think he faces to this preeminent position. And secondly, and you said that you would be cautious about specific policies, but I would be very interested to push you a little bit on Taiwan. Taiwan now seems to be the flashpoint. There are lots of flashpoints with China, but this seems to be something that anyway in the last few months has become really much more testing and pressing. What do you understand as the American commitment to Taiwan these days? And how do you think that the confrontation between the Taiwanese and the Chinese, because the Taiwanese certainly don't seem to want to be unified with China, how do you see that being managed and progressing?
Sure, I'll let you take those questions.
I will, okay. I will start with Xi's grip on power, although unfortunately, there's not that much I can say about it, except to say it is a matter of great interest to us. We are investigating the matter, but as of today, we regard the Chinese Communist Party as having a fairly strong grip on power within China. We're aware of certain stress lines within the party. I think I'll leave it at that. Taiwan is, needless to say, a matter of great importance to us. I can tell you that the State Department is giving the most careful attention to the question of Taiwan. We have noticed that since the global pandemic hit, that China has imposed a national security law on Hong Kong, has stepped up actions in the South China Sea, has engaged in provocations on the border with India, and we naturally, therefore, take very seriously the vulnerabilities of Taiwan. So I won't go beyond saying that we're acutely aware that matter and considering what steps are necessary to support Taiwan against any possible aggression. Now, Leslie, as for your questions, there's a question about Europe and the China challenge. So as I was saying to you earlier before we went live, of course, the United States has rather dramatically changed its attitudes about its understanding of China in the last couple of years under President Trump and in the State Department under Secretary Pompeo. And even, and I must say, when I began meeting with European officials, European counterparts last fall, I would hear time and again that they would say to me, if you had met with us 2 years before, so 2017, none of us would be speaking to you about China. But China is now not only on our radar screens, it's right up there. Now, our European friends are not where we, the United States, are on the China challenge. They obviously do not understand the China challenge as I've just laid it out. And that's one of the reasons that I think the Secretary Pompeo has undertaken to educate actually the United States and the world about the China challenge. He's done something that very few Secretary of States have done. Last October at the Hudson Institute, he gave a speech called the China Challenge. And in that speech, he announced that he would be delivering a series of speeches about the China challenge. And those speeches were less about concrete policies, although sometimes they did deal with concrete policies. They're less about Chinese concrete policies and more about outlining the scope and the urgency of the China challenge. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, why other countries may be behind us on this, but also explains why the United States, from the point of view of the State Department 2020, from Secretary Pompeo's point of view, the United States was late to understanding the China challenge. Why is that? Partly because also our economies are so intensely wound together with China's economy. So in nation after nation, we in the United States hear that you've got to understand we have enormous economic interests in doing business with China. The truth is the American economy is bound up in very significant ways with the Chinese economy. We understand that. Our position, however, is that we still must understand the intensity of the threat. We also must understand that what we may think in the short run is an economic benefit could in the intermediate term and in the long term pose present real economic harms to countries. One dramatic example of which is the CCP commandeering of supply chains, as we've all discovered in the wake of the global pandemic. So, excuse me. So we don't expect a radical decoupling of economies, but we think it would be wise to seek to reduce reliance upon China for essential goods. And we think it would be wise to condition our economic dealings with China on the basis of fair and reciprocal trading practices, which has been a part of the president's approach from the very beginning. However, having said all that, we reject the idea that we sometimes hear from European friends that the United States itself is behaving in a high-handed fashion by putting European friends and partners in an awkward position, forcing them to choose between the United States and the People's Republic of China. That certainly is not how we look at the matter. The way we look at the matter is we are inviting our friends, like-minded partners, to join us in defending freedom against what we regard as the #1 global threat to freedom in every region of the world. So we recognize that we have to continue talking, we have to continue presenting our case on China, and we intend to do just that. But I think you had a second question that I haven't addressed. That was just on European views.
No, the question was if the vulnerabilities that you outline are as they are, why not just let it run rather than coming back aggressively?
Yes, well, the reason is that that we all have vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities does not guarantee defeat, and strengths and virtues do not guarantee victory. So it would be, from our point of view, highly irresponsible to suppose that because China has vulnerabilities, that it is bound to fade anytime soon. Maybe it will, and when we're dealing with China, we should certainly keep these vulnerabilities in mind. But just as you know, a self-aware nation state has to be aware of its own vulnerabilities, the US has vulnerabilities, the UK has vulnerabilities, China has vulnerabilities. We will, as we deal with China, we'll keep those in mind. And I want to emphasize, from the US point of view, we seek cooperation, again, based on fairness and reciprocity in all areas where it's possible. The problem is that in many cases we can't cooperate on the basis of fairness and reciprocity. So we are not asking for the Europeans to sever relations, but once again, to recognize that, that there is a struggle afoot in the world right now over freedom, and that we want to be securing freedom in partnership with the UK and in partnership with Europeans.
Robin Niblett, next question.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Peter. I put my hand up so valiantly because I didn't see a lot of hands going up, but I could see some good questions coming in the chat line. So maybe I should have kept my hand down. But Peter, welcome to this call, and thank you very much for sharing your views of the China challenge. I was going to pick up a little bit the challenge of European perspectives as well, so maybe I'll just throw out a couple of my interpretations and then finish it up with a question. I think most Europeans, and I think I would include a majority of maybe UK views, or I think even the UK is shifting, as is a lot of continental Europe right now, are deeply concerned, number one, about the IP threat and the economic threat of having to compete with state-owned and state-backed industries in an open market, which I think is unfair. But I think importantly, and this gets to your point, there's a real concern in European governments about the spread of the surveillance state, let's call it as a shorthand, and that the Chinese government is actively, and the CCP is actively looking to change the debate within UN institutions. There's an interesting question about that, which I won't repeat in the Q&A line, which Leslie can pick up in a minute, that they're being quite successful on that front. And I suppose most Europeans would probably accept that there is a regional dimension to China's dominance. It's certainly in the South China Sea, certainly an ability to use its economic might to force political outcomes within its region. But when I think most Europeans look globally, they don't see the threat at the same level of scale as the US does. The Europeans don't have the same security commitments in Asia. And ultimately, I suppose, as I heard one European diplomat say on an on-the-record call, we want to be realist. The Trump administration is being utopian. It's not often that you hear, you know, the Europeans being called realists and the Americans being called utopians. It was probably deliberate. But I think the view was that somehow the policy the Trump administration is advocating is one that tries to say China has to stop, or the CCP has to stop being the CCP.
Oh, I see.
And that therefore, ultimately, no deal can be done with the CCP, which almost is, you know, regime change.
Yes.
And that is the concern that, you know, given what you said about the CCP being so alien in its goals, and both for the Chinese people and in terms of the international system, it is impossible to foresee any type of interdependence. And therefore, any solution that's come out of Secretary Pompeo of the Trump administration has been seen as being too extreme to be practical. I suppose that'd be my nutshell. And I'm just wondering what you'd say about this idea that, in a way, that in its rejection of any space, in a way, for China to grow under the CCP, you may actually be driving Chinese nationalism. You may actually be arming the CCP to be stronger than it might otherwise be if you just gave it a bit more room to fail.
Can't rule that out entirely, but it seems to me unlikely. The CCP has been in power for a long time now. It may be, as I've suggested, brittle in ways, but it seems to me it's just as good an argument, better argument, that by putting pressure on the CCP, we're showing the people of China that the United States, and we hope the rest of the world, hasn't lost sight of their legitimate claims to have their human rights protected. One point. Second point, as far as the Europeans, in this case being the realists, and the Trump administration being utopians, yes, I am tickled by this description. Well, where to begin? First, it's not quite right. It's not right to say that the United States is against deals. In fact, as you know, we entered into a deal, notwithstanding Secretary Pompeo's very tough language. We entered into a deal with the Chinese back in January, a trade deal, which was characterized as phase one of a trade deal. I think our language has been rather consistent on this matter. Again, cooperation, yes, but it's got to be cooperation that restores fair and reciprocal trade relations on the basis of established international norms. A third point, we were speaking to a British diplomat in response to the question, how would you characterize China's position in South America? The reply was dominant, period. So once again, we return to the need to educate people. If realism means taking the world as it really is, then neglecting China's inroads in other regions of the world, even regions that the Europeans may not be as involved in, seems to me to be unrealistic, pretending away, imagining away real challenges. What else? I think there might have been a final point, but that'll be enough for now, I suppose. Thank you.
I think it's fair to come to Xiao, and if you unmute and if you say who you are and ask your questions.
Hello, hi, this is Xiao from Chinese Embassy here in London. And I listened very carefully, and frankly speaking, we cannot agree with about the so-called China challenge. I used to work in the United States, but I believe that over the past decades, what China and the United States has been undergoing is not smooth sailing. There are ups and downs, but what it is more important is to have more mutual respect, treat each other as equals, and to seek common ground while putting aside the differences. And I believe these are the keys to solve the differences between us. So I will have a question for you, that how would you look at China? Do you think it's possible to decouple from China, and how can the two sides solve the differences between the two? And apart from any challenge, do you think there are areas for cooperation between the two? Thank you.
Thank you. As I've already indicated, I certainly do think that there are areas There are opportunities for cooperation. I believe the Trump administration has already demonstrated its interest in cooperating where possible. We've emphasized trade. We entered a phase 1 trade deal. We're looking to complete the next phase. It is the American position to seek all opportunities for cooperation, but again, cooperation based on fair and reciprocal relations, which reflect the norms of the established order, which respect the rule of law, which respect human rights, which respect the sovereignty of the nation states around the world. Under those conditions, we welcome cooperation.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 questions now. Dominique Caratu and Elena Lazarou. If you go first, Dominique.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. A lot to ask, so I won't try and hog the thing. Let me just ask a simple question. In the first Cold War, the US represented itself or caricatured itself as standing up for truth, justice, and the American way.
Yes.
Is such a moral position or stance quite as strong and credible internationally now, post-Iraq invasion, the financial crisis, and even the last 4 years of Make America Great Again?
And I'm going to come to Elena next.
Thank you, Leslie. Pleasure to participate in this discussion. Hi, I'm Elena Lazarou. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House, and I head the External Policies Unit of the European Parliament's Research Service. Very interesting discussion. Actually, I wanted to take it away from the Europe-US-China axis for a second, and I wanted to ask you in terms of policy planning. Obviously, the China challenge plays out in other theaters as well. It has to do a lot with what China is doing in Africa, Latin America, other parts of the world. So I was wondering, in terms of US policy planning, to what extent does the potential implication of what US policy could mean in terms of China's relative influence in a given region play into policy planning with regard to US policy towards Africa, towards Latin America, towards other places? So to what extent is it a consideration? And have you seen this change throughout the past years when thinking of how the US interacts with areas that could potentially fall under even greater influence of China? And if I may follow up on the Europe issue that a number of people have raised, I was wondering if you could make it even more concrete in the sense that there are discussions now about this proposed high-level dialogue between the US and the EU on China. So what are the issues you think could be seen in this context, as addressed in this context, and would this dialogue involve the UK as well? It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on how you would see that playing out. Thank you very much.
Before you answer that, Peter, because I think this next question might follow on. I know this is a lot, especially with jet lag, so stay with us. I'm going to turn to Alice Ekman to ask a question. Alice, if you could tell us who you are. I know who you are, but if you could tell us.
Thank Leslie, and thank you for this great event. I have one small comment and
If
one
you can
question.
say who you are, Alice.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sorry about this. So my name is Alice Ekman. I'm senior analyst in charge of China and Asia at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, which is an EU agency. First on Europe, I'm a bit surprised about your comment regarding the perception of the China challenge in Europe. As you know, in Brussels and in many EU member states' capital, all the points that you mentioned are well known. And we are many China analysts in Europe pointing at this, and there is understanding. And COVID-19, prior to COVID-19, there was this understanding of the China challenge based on doctrine, based on analysis of speeches of Xi Jinping, but the COVID-19 has reinforced also the perception that there is an issue in terms of competition of model and also disinformation. So this is nothing new, and if we have the impression that we need to be educated, transatlantic dialogue will not be eased on China anytime soon. So I I hope that also in Washington, there's an understanding that basically we understand China. That's the first comment. The question is related to the interesting point you mentioned regarding reconfiguring the established order as one of the two goals of China under Xi Jinping. We are also really aware of this and analyzing how China integrates the UN system and many international organizations over the last decades and even more. The US has appointed an envoy to counter malinfluence in international organizations, especially has appointed a special envoy for multilateral integrity in January 2020. My question is, isn't it too late? What is the work? What is the outcome of this appointment in terms of readjusting the trend in international organization? Mark Lambert has certainly been very active, so I would be interested to have your assessment. And don't you think it's too late in terms of reversing this trend, especially at a time where the US has still withdrawn and is continuing to withdrawing from key multilateral organizations?
That's quite a lot, Peter. But
that's a lot of questions. I'm not sure I can cover it all, but let me try. First of all, I actually meant to indicate the opposite of the impression I gave apparently about Europe. I thought I had said that I was pleasantly surprised last year when I found in my conversations that there was growing awareness about the China challenge, that I was assured that the China challenge was at or near the top of the agendas of countries throughout Europe. As far as education goes, again, I didn't mean anything insulting by that. The Secretary of State, by the way, gave a speech in February to the Governors Association of the United States of America, in which governors of all 50 states gather. And he told them, you all may not be aware of the various inroads that China has made in your states. You may not be aware of the various forms of economic dependence that you are cultivating. You all may not be aware of the various ways in which Chinese technology is being installed in your states, or your pension funds are now going to be dependent on Chinese companies that are connected to the government that endanger your independence and the United States' well-being. So this is the term education was not meant to imply that we are not all equal and sovereign nation states. It's just meant to say that we in the United States may emphasize some aspects of it, but I also want to emphasize that our view is that to meet the China challenge properly, it's going to be necessary for the community of nations devoted to freedom and democracy to work together on the matter. So that's one point. On the question about the work of the policy planning staff and State Department in general, the State Department in general is home to thousands and thousands and thousands of employees. The policy planning staff is home to about 22 members and researchers and administrative support. So no more than 30 people. It is much easier to turn the policy planning staff than it is to turn the State Department as a whole. So I can report to you about my office. We haven't neglected, I believe, any region of the world, but our specialists on Africa look at a whole range of African questions with the question of China in mind, economic questions, development questions, educational questions, are asked in light of what are the Chinese doing on the continent and how can we meet those challenges. So, and this is true from the Arctic to South America. The State Department is a larger ship than the policy planning staff itself, but it, under Secretary Pompeo's direction, it too is turning. on the question of the Cold War, America championing, let's say, freedom, I think that's right. We are not, in my judgment, in a new, well, I put it this way. The struggle with China is very different from the struggle with the Soviet Union. It's true that the Soviet Union was animated by a mix of Marxist-Leninist and nationalist elements, as is the Chinese Communist Party. It's true that the Soviet Union stood for an alternative conception of world order, with Moscow at the center. So in that sense, the China challenge is like the Soviet challenge. But the Soviet Union proceeded by way of military power. They held half of Europe through force of arms. They exported revolution, arms, supported proxies, installed puppet governments, and more. China doesn't work in that fashion. China works primarily through the wielding of its economic clout. But in our judgment, freedom is just as much at stake. On the question of, well, where does the United States get off defending freedom after the Iraq War and other, in the eyes of some people, other deficiencies? And I think the answer is this. This is a point that actually we stress, Leslie, in the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. We must always recognize the fundamental distinction between liberal democracies that fall short of their principles. The United States belongs to that class of liberal democracies that fall short of their principles. Just like all nation states have vulnerabilities, all liberal democracies fall short of their principles. We must distinguish between liberal democracies that fall short of their principles and nation states and regimes that reject those principles outright. So notwithstanding our perfections, I think that it is incumbent upon the United States, by virtue of our size and by virtue of our own commitments to unalienable rights, which, by the way, is 18th century language for human rights, the rights inherent in all persons, by virtue of our deep commitment to political societies based on the rights inherent in all persons, and based on our deep commitment to an international order that is friendly to free and independent nation states. It's incumbent upon the United States to do what we can to lead in this generation's struggle to secure freedom.
You've opened up so many things, even in your closing comments about the Commission, about the grounding of human rights in US traditions and documents and declarations, which means we do have to have you return to those questions and you come back. There's a lot on the table. There's clearly a lot of disagreement, not only about how we understand China, but certainly how we respond to it. I think that there's clearly a lot of concern across Europe, and it sounds like interest in the US as well, that in the midst of understanding the elements of the China challenge, that we also recognize the extreme need for the United States and China to continue to increase their level of cooperation when it comes to issues of climate, of public health, of global economic governance. Clearly, I think that a lot of people certainly here are very worried about how this increased tension will hinder the prospects for what is seen to be the two countries that will matter most in ensuring the effectiveness of global governance going forward. So there's a tremendous amount here. I'm deeply grateful for you taking the time. I can see you have a full schedule. And traveling during a pandemic is not an easy thing to do. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Leslie.
I do recommend to all of you who would like to understand more, both Peter's thinking and also the thinking of policy planning under your directorship, to take a look at your website, which I found very useful, peterberkowitz.com. And we will look forward to, can you remind us when the report from policy planning will be released?
We will have probably in the next month.
Okay, nothing like a deadline, a publicly stated deadline to force your hand, depending on how the jet lag is from Indonesia. We look forward to reading that, the elements of the China Challenge, the report that will be released from you, because it will help us to understand more of your perspective. Please do return. Thank you so much for doing this, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.